Okay, so sometimes for Let's Talk PlayStation on Friday mornings, we are naturally going to miss stories that pop up later in the day, but that's not normally a problem because Fridays are typically quiet for the games business. Except yesterday was a huge exception, so we are not going to wait until next week. Let's talk about these three key items right now. One, the God of War Amazon TV series put out a still from the show, and it looks weird off. It's very much a little bit just stiff, maybe artificial. The image is weird, so we'll leave it there. The other big thing is PSSR's big update is confirmed. We were expecting that very soon, and based on that footage from Digital Foundry's initial RE Requiem coverage, PS5 Pro looked incredibly good. The results were fantastic, and so the initial suspicions were that, oh, they might be embargoed and they can't talk about this. Sure enough, RE Requiem has the new PSSR update. More games are coming next month, and PS5 Pro is getting a system-level toggle to enhance the image quality for existing PSSR games right now, so that should be a huge boon to PlayStation 5 Pro and its usability, but Requiem so far really does deliver some incredible results. So there's that. And then the other big expose is from Bloomberg's Jason Schreier about the entire scenario for Bluepoint Games, Sony, and what is going on with the Bloodborne IP. How has this not been remade or ported? How has Bluepoint not worked on it? We finally have some very valuable insight. So let's go over the entire thing. First off, Jason writes that after being acquired, Bluepoint, the studio, had ambitions to make its own game instead of co-developing or remaking games by other companies, which does track with what the president of Bluepoint Games said back when they were acquired in 2021, Marco Thrush, saying they want to go do bigger and better things, be ambitious, and do new content. Now, having said that, the God of War live service game that they settled on after working on Ragnarok for about 2 years, we found out the game was about Atreus falling into Hades, and the loose idea would be that players would control different versions or aspects of Atreus and battle through Greek hell. Then there would be some co-op elements and some kind of ongoing support because, again, this is a live service title, but it seems like they didn't really make much progress, and notably some Bluepoint staff members thought they should be working on traditional action games that were single player like Demon's Souls or Ragnarok instead of strictly live service, which that is also a crucial component to remember here, is that no matter where we hear these things, that's why usually you want multiple people to sort of back up a claim of what might have been the broad consensus, but individuality is still important. Some people probably were well aware that, hey, I work at Bluepoint and I don't really want to be doing a live service game, so it's at least insightful to hear that some people were very aware they didn't want to work on that game. But anyway, after years of little progress, the cancellation happened in January 2025, which we know, and this is where Bloodborne comes in. So Jason writes, quote, in early 2025, when Bluepoint again pitched the idea of a Bloodborne remake, the studio was told that the numbers made sense, but FromSoftware didn't want it to happen, according to people familiar with the process. Now, this is incredibly similar language to what Shuhei Yoshida said, speaking with Kinda Funny, that his personal theory, he wasn't confirming anything, but after having left the company, his personal theory was that PlayStation perhaps wants to respect Hidetaka Miyazaki's wishes that he might be too busy and can't work on that project himself, because that is basically his baby. He's been very open about this. He is very passionate and loves Bloodborne, and so that was Shuhei's thinking back then, and it sounds like that is indeed what was going on with why Bloodborne was never a thing. But anyway, with that rejection out of the way, Bluepoint spent some time pitching an updated version of Shadow of the Colossus Remake, and Sony turned that down. Then, attempting more original content, Bluepoint pitched new projects in other franchises, such as a spin-off for Ghost of Tsushima, but nothing was greenlit. So, pertinently here, multiple projects were pitched, only one being named from Jason Schreier is Ghost of Tsushima as a spinoff. Another crucial point here is that some of the other studios have been facing heavy financial pressure in recent years, and they were concerned about dedicating resources to someone else's project. So at this point in time, it's been more than a year without securing a project for Bluepoint, and so when the God of War Trilogy remake was announced, some Bluepoint employees felt uneasy, and then the shutdown came in a week later, which that is tied more closely together than I think some would believe, because this sort of implies that there was a conflict of interest in what Bluepoint was attempting to pitch, because they were looking to do, whether it is a remake or some sort of new original content, but it's an existing universe, and having to work and collaborate with other studios. But if those other studios are not really in a position or want to do that and offload resources, that becomes a problem. That adds more insight into the God of War trilogy remake itself, and that might explain why it's in-house and they want to do very minimal outsourcing for Santa Monica, right? And this goes back to a point, or a prediction rather, that I made a long time ago about Bluepoint and their project before we knew it was a God of War live service thing. And I thought, like, well, if you look at their staff, right, they're missing very key roles to lead development of a project, which sort of implies that they might still be in a code development or support role. And so I thought, oh, maybe they're working on Cory Barlog's game, but they're missing vital roles like a game director, for example. And so in situations like that, this dials back to what we're talking about now, and that whatever they're pitching for other studios, other properties within SIE, within the PlayStation playbook, those existing teams might have to assign a game director to them or something. So it's just, that's sort of loosely kind of what I'm getting at here, but it seems very clear that there might have been an unfortunate conflict of interest for Bluepoint and their business model and trying to make it work. But behind the scenes, getting back to the article, it said that Sony no longer thought Bluepoint was able to make its own game or find a partnership that makes sense. Now, that was according to people familiar with the company's thinking. Also worth mentioning that it turns out some companies were apparently reaching out to Bluepoint, making some phone calls to Sony maybe, and trying to salvage the studio closure and do something there. That was again based on people familiar with the situation, but as Jason closes out the article, they say the prospect seems unlikely. So, wow, how do we acknowledge and wrap this whole thing up? It's pretty insane. I mean, a handful of things in there are still, for the most part, as we understood it, or at least how I understood it. We know there was a small window after the God of War live service thing where it turns out they were pitching a handful of things. And not to say that we have to, find blame here, but I think it's safe to say we have a better picture of some accountability from the various parties involved here. And so, for example, with Bluepoint, I find it a bit odd to pitch a Shadow of the Colossus PS5 native version. I would almost think maybe the logic there was something similar to the director cut games on PlayStation 5, where they have a very quick turnaround cycle, and they're very soft native PS5 versions, because I'm not sure how much more they're going to realistically do to a PS4 game that was already inherently a remake. Now there is new content they could possibly add, and that was the running theory from that one report that now actually is far more accurate, but we'll talk about that in a second. That one seemed very puzzling to me as far as a named pitch that they did, but the negligence still largely falls on Sony for letting the studio flounder for years on a God of War live service game. And it's so noteworthy how Jason points out that for some people at Bluepoint, they were fully behind the idea of, why don't we just do the traditional stuff that we're good at, Because that's always the gray area of these conversations. We can't just say something and that's the broad understanding and picture of 70-something people at a studio. I mean, I think it should go without saying that there are people at Bluepoint and there are people at PlayStation that probably understood, why the hell did this get approved? Why did we let them do this? Why are we making this game? There's surely people that don't get to make those decisions that felt that way, but at least that's worth acknowledging. So the Bloodborne stuff, let's talk about that. I mean, so for the longest time, my opinion on Bloodborne, I don't know about other people, but it's always been PlayStation ain't stupid. They might look stupid and they might make very questionable decisions, as we're discussing right now, but they're also not that dumb. They know people want a Bloodborne remake, even just a basic port, even just a basic 60 FPS patch. But certain things just have to happen, and these still are businesses where the stars have to align, and it can be very circumstantial. So I think PlayStation always knew that it made sense. But the running theory that made the most sense, and this was even before Shuhei said it, but it's got to be something with FromSoftware. Whether it's a contractual thing where they have a right to refusal. So even though PlayStation owns the IP, that is very much true. Everyone's talking about it right now. That's part of the drama with this whole controversy, is that PlayStation owns it. They could, in theory, on paper, do whatever they want with Bloodborne. But whether it's contractual with FromSoftware or not, there might just simply be a matter of, Does From even want this to happen? That's where this opens up a whole layer of the conversation, and that it sounds like maybe FromSoftware is unhappy with what happened with Demon Souls. So there's been a lot of debate back and forth ever since this news broke out on Friday. Now, I want to at least paint a better picture of what we know publicly. So back in 2020, the Demon Souls creative director, Gavin Moore, he confirmed to GameSpot that Miyazaki and FromSoftware gave their blessing and were happy for them to do the Demon Souls remake. But again, very crucial here, they were not involved in the day-to-day production of the game. It was entirely handled by the teams at Sony and Bluepoint. And then in 2022, the only public thing we have here, speaking with Edge Magazine, is that Miyazaki said he had not played the Demon Souls remake, and that was simply because he is not a fan of replaying his old work. He elaborated that it brings up old emotions, lots of memories, and it's overwhelming, but he was willing to say that he's glad it got a fresh look with current-gen graphics. He was actually somewhat complimentary. He said, quote, "One thing that was really fun was seeing Bluepoint Games come up with things we didn't consider and to approach certain elements of the game, its visuals and its mechanics in a way that we either couldn't or didn't back in the day. So to see them researching and applying these new thought processes and new techniques, this was something that was really exciting and interesting for me." Of course, public statements only go a long way, and he could feel entirely different, but we are hearing from people like Nate the Hate, where he goes by Nate Drake over on Recent Era, on a thread discussing this news, where somebody was talking about how Miyazaki said Bloodborne is his personal favorite, it's his baby. Nate did say that it has been long believed that FromSoftware and Miyazaki were not happy with the Demon Souls PS5 remake. So we already have an understanding here that Bluepoint and Sony did go out of their way to get approval from FromSoftware, get their blessing, because even though they don't need it, it's something where, out of respect for the business, the relationship that they have with that studio, it was something they seemingly went out and got. And we have more people doubling down on that is indeed what is taking place here, in that we know they've done it for Demon Souls, and so they might be a little bit sour based on that with Bloodborne, because we also have this tweet here from Jeff Grubb. He was, quote, retweeting Lance McDonald. He does a lot of streaming and boundary-breaking videos and stuff on PT and FromSoft titles. He's a huge fan of those games, and he is respected in the community, but you know, he's been a bit more outspoken about the whole thing, and he's not totally buying the idea that Sony is really respecting the source material and FromSoftware's blessings. But Jeff at least doubles down. He says, "It's not a lie, it's exactly what happened, although I get where Lance is coming from, because Sony doesn't have to care about what From says, but if it doesn't, would it ever get to work with From again?" I would think that is definitely what's going on, because again, Sony owns the IP. Like, they know Elden Ring did incredibly well. Souls games have blown up into the stratosphere. They're cultural icons. They sell in the millions nowadays. Sony was able to actually secure and lock down Demon Souls and even Bloodborne. But you know, Bloodborne was over 10 years ago. Elden Ring really catapulted these games into massive cultural icons. And so to go back on that studio, it would be a bad look. I would agree. It's not something you want to do, especially if, for example, there is a souring of that relationship based on what happened with Demon Souls. And that's another big element of this whole debate and drama, is that, and it's well documented now, a lot of diehard Demon Souls fans, and also fans of Shadow of the Colossus even, they had genuine issues and complaints with the artistic interpretations and the mood changes of those games in particular. With Demon Souls, and I've definitely gone down the rabbit hole, because for a while I was a little bit more naive to this. I was actually shocked when I first heard that a lot of hardcore Demon Souls fans were upset with the remake. I'm like, what are you talking about? So I've seen a lot of the comparison shots and the language, and a lot of people making their case of like, this is why it doesn't really resonate that well for me, and they're actually very upset, which in turn, in light of this news, now a lot of fans are like, great, we didn't want Bluepoint to touch Bloodborne anyway. But looking at all that stuff, I can empathize completely with those fans. It's funny, because I think some people don't realize that, yeah, a lot of folks really were unhappy with the Demon Souls remake, despite it selling well, critical reception incredibly high. It is one of the most beautiful looking current generation games, and it was available day one, and I had a fantastic time with it. So I am not one of those people. I empathize, though, because at least I think the line of thinking here is that when you love something that deeply, it's much more vulnerable to those changes and criticisms and any sort of change that takes place with that property. So for example, with me, I deeply loved the Jak and Daxter games, right? These are very old PS2 games now at this point. And I've had people over the years ask, would you love to see a new Jak and Daxter game? Would you love to see a remake? And some people might be surprised to hear me say no. Like, I don't want that, because I'm like too far gone with my deep love and appreciation for it, in that anything that comes up, even if Naughty Dog does it, like their interpretation of what it should look like nowadays and the changes they might make to that source material, whether it's a new entry or they do remake it, but it's just going to be so much more vulnerable to those changes for somebody like me, whereas a more casual platforming fan might like buy a Jak and Daxter remake and have a great time with it. So I actually can totally see the line of thinking for diehard Demon Souls fans or Shadow fans, but that has been a point of contention. A lot of the fans are upset with the changes, and potentially Miyazaki might not have been too thrilled with what happened with Demon Souls. We don't actually know that. It's aired out as sort of like an open secret in the games business. I can't speak to that, but we only have public comments, and public comments are almost always going to be more favorable anyway, so we don't really know what Miyazaki's really thinking, but everything that has been lining up so far sort of implies that that is indeed what is happening, and Sony is trying to mend some wounds there with respecting the source material, which is the right decision from PlayStation, mind you. They own the IP, they could do it, but you don't want that attitude of going off and doing whatever you want with it because you own it. Sony, I think, and this is also pretty well known too, they do care about the relationships in the games business. It might not always seem like it. They can make very cutthroat decisions like any other organization, but we do tend to hear situations like this where they do have a respect for the creators that they work with, and usually if it's a bigger name too, they'll probably bend over for you, and it sounds like they're willing to do that for somebody like FromSoft. Now, having said all that, the one report that initially seemed very dubious and not a good source that we discussed on Friday for LTPS, that was previously from the account known as Detective Seeds. Now they've changed their name. But that report, actually, it seems like they did get genuine info and speak with Bluepoint employees. The problem is that that particular account has gotten so much stuff wrong, like way off previously, that they were now seen as a very bad source. So the one time they get some credible info, it's like a boy cries wolf scenario. So I would think that if they're ever going to try and do this again, do not say anything unless you've got some fairly reliable information if you want to try and rebuild the reputation a bit, because otherwise I was pretty convinced that we should maybe not pay attention to what's being said here, because it was way too specific and the language of it was very weird, and you did still have a handful of people chime in saying that, yeah, some might be right, not all of it, and all of it wasn't still completely accurate, so just a whole little weird thing there. But it's worth still acknowledging that a lot of that was indeed genuine ahead of the Bloomberg Jason Schreier report. Having said that, though, it is really great to finally have a much better idea of why don't we have Bloodborne yet? Well, at least on the surface, it would appear as though it is a little bit of some FromSoft and Sony trying to mend a relationship. We know why Bluepoint was shut down. I still don't agree with it, and I still think it was absolutely tragic, and there's still massive negligence on PlayStation's part to waste the money by approving them to do a game that they really should not have been doing, have no business doing. It sucks that they probably felt compelled to pitch that, and that is an environment that Sony was fostering because they were investing so much in live service. There is still, there was a timeline where Bluepoint was doing bigger and better things under PlayStation's ownership, and like I said, 2 weeks ago, that did not happen under PlayStation, and that is the real tragic loss of talented people that are now going to go somewhere else. So, thank you all so much for joining me in this conversation. I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.